Hi, welcome everybody. It is absolutely thrilling to see so many people here gathered to listen to these presentations. Hi, I'm Rishona Zimring. I'm a professor of English here at Lewis and Clark College. And I'm a little nervous to be this early in the program and getting used to the logistics, but so far so elegant. And thank you, as always, to Kim Brodkin, to the symposium co-organizers, and to the logistical geniuses who are able to put together these Zoom events. And of course, thank you to our presenters. I'm just going to say a few words about the organization of the panel and our procedure. In a moment, I will gesture towards our first presenter, Emma Poyer, and then we'll hear from each presenter in this order: Emma, Poyer, Ryce, Matsumoto, and third, Phoenix Bruner, for about 15 to 20 minutes each for them to give their presentations. While they're presenting, feel free to note down questions or comments in your own thinking about what they're saying. We will have ample time at the end of the three presentations for Q&A and discussion. So one way to pose questions is to post them while you're thinking of them as they come to your mind during the presentations in the chat of the Zoom. And you can chat with Kim Brodkin privately who will be collecting and organizing the questions. So as you look at the chat and you go to the participants, you can send your question to Kim Brodkin privately, or in your own notes, you can be thinking of questions and comments. And then when we turn to discussion at the end of the panel, you can use the reaction function to raise your hand. And if that proves difficult for some reason, you can always raise your hand and I'll be keeping an eye out. But without further ado, I think it is time for us to be the audience for these three really interesting presentations. And I will ask each presenter to briefly introduce themselves and announce the current title of their project. So Emma, thank you for leading the way. And our first presenter is Emma Poyer.
Hello, thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone who helped make this event possible. My name is Emma. I use she, they pronouns. I am a senior at UPS where I study gender and queer studies and African American studies. And today I will be talking about my gender and queer studies senior thesis, the Girl House Project, Narratives of Girlhood and Building a Site of Analysis. And I am going to share my screen and get started. Okay. So once again, welcome. A little bit of kind of important context before we dive into this. Though I'll be speaking about my thesis project, the Girl House Project was actually a collaborative effort between myself and a peer, Miranda Carson. We received a grant through our university and spent the summer conceptualizing and quite literally creating the Girl House. And I will now be locating that work in the theoretical world of gender and queer studies. A few more things. I want to give a content warning in a few different ways. I will be talking pretty explicitly about sexual assault, violence, and emotional abuse. There will be moments where we do some close reading of text together that mentions and reflects on these things. But I'll also be using language in the context of all of these issues. Throughout the presentation, I'll try to give a more explicit content warning before we read some of the text, but please be aware of this at any point. If you need to leave, mute me, come in and out of the presentation, please do that. Take care of yourself. This is heavy work. All right, this is the Girl House. This is also the Girl House. The Girl House is a 14x7 tiny home, a traveling house on wheels, a mobile art installation, a storytelling vehicle, and a collective biography. Inside the house are stories, memories, reflections, poems, prose, submissions that reflect on girlhood, growing up, and learning sex within rape culture. The Girl House is a traveling interactive art piece. You can see my peer, Miranda Garcia Carson, and I at the Girl House first installation. We spent the summer learning how to use, amongst many tools, power drills and various types of tools for cutting lumber. It was a big first, but one that was very rewarding, and it yielded this incredible space. Because of COVID, we collected over 200 virtual submissions throughout the summer that we then installed within the house. The house is interactive, and so when you come to an installation, you're able to contribute your own voice in a variety of ways. If it's writing on the wall, reflecting to a prompt, putting a letter in our mailbox, or hanging it on a clothespin. The project understands gender as a constructed identity and girlhood as a moment of that gender production. The Girl House pursues an understanding and attempts to visualize how rape culture, a system that relies on patriarchy and heteronormativity, grasps onto girlhood, shaping the adolescent experiences through the way it teaches sexuality, sex, and gender. The Girl House project attempts to illuminate the lived reality of this gendered coming of age by inviting stories and reflections on growing up, early experiences of sexuality and sex, all within this culture or the system of rape culture. Furthermore, we call it a collective biography, and that's what I will attempt to locate today more theoretically, because of history of feminist methodology that understands the potential and political and social power of narrative. It is literally a collective biography. It collects stories and is ever growing. We hope that it illustrates an expansion of how we can comprehend the girl identity and resist essentialization, in an effort to illuminate the production of girlhood as one rooted in this system of sexual injustice. One more thing before I move on, I'm going to use this phrase sexual injustice throughout the presentation. It is not exclusively referencing interpersonal violence, but rather the systemic injustice that rape culture produces and subjects girls to. So my argument is that collective biography and the public display of autonomous narratives expands our understanding of girlhood as a moment of gender production and offers a space for reclamation, resistance, and liberation. In terms of some literature that really founded my work, this project is rooted in foundational gender studies texts, including the work of Judith Butler, who helps us understand gender as a constructed social identity, and introduces the idea of girling as a way of describing the process of being subjected to an ideology of gender. Judith Butler was also foundational to the emerging field of girlhood studies, and specifically, there's kind of two spearheaders of the field, Susan Gannon and Marina Gonick, who really influenced my work. Girlhood studies preoccupies itself with trying to complicate and understand girlhood as this period of gendered becoming and expand our understanding of what it means to be a girl and the possibility of girlhood. It understands girlhood as a period in which gender is meant to be solidified and attempts to disrupt and resist the essentialization of that experience. So the Girl House Project and my work here adopts both of these theoretical landscapes, and by creating a space to illustrate the complexity of girlhood specifically, or attempts to illustrate the complexity of girlhood specifically in reference to its interaction with rape culture. I've included a submission here given to the Girl House Project that I think illustrates well kind of the complication that we're trying to create in this project. So I'll read it. We are encouraged to be free, but not too free, to be wild, but not too wild, to be sexy, but not slutty. I remember feeling mad because I felt misjudged and misunderstood for it. But I don't remember analyzing it. We accepted it or we rebelled against it. And sometimes we did both. So what I really love about starting with this submission is that it speaks really well to the way that girlhood is presented as this experience in which you must adhere to, but that it exists with all of these possibilities for resistance and discovery and becoming. And it also shows really vulnerably the way that that is navigated by the individual. Additionally, and kind of the second and important part of this project is using collective biography and specifically autonomous narrative as the method for this project, and also the resistance that this project is trying to foster. So this project is very, very influenced and inspired by Black feminist thought, specifically the work by Patricia Hill Collins that helps that tells us that narrative, specifically by those who have been marginalized and have systemically and historically and ongoingly have had their voices silenced in normative modes of knowledge production, have voices and stories that offer a resistance to what we know and also a political potential. She helps us understand that voice and voices of marginalized people as offers an opportunity not for just unity and healing within the community itself, but also with a larger political potential. Additionally, I was very influenced by the work of Tanya Sersier, who traces the history of these conferences in the 1980s. They were called 1980s, the feminist speak out conferences. And it was a moment when we really saw the solidification of rape as a political issue. It was one of the first kind of widespread moments when women were telling their experiences of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the workplace. And it led to a lot of political formation and organizing around rape as an issue that needed to be addressed on kind of a larger scale. But it also was a really powerful moment when people began speaking about their experiences that had been formerly really repressed, and offered an opportunity for people to find solidarity and support and kind of a means of social connection. And so there's this duality with voice and narrative. It's not just the opportunity for a political moment, it's also the opportunity to find healing and support and community. So for the methodology of my project, I mentioned earlier, we received over 200 virtual submissions with the Girl House project. Once we had our first installation, we received substantially more. So for my thesis, through a system of patterning and finding common themes in all of these narratives, I became very intimate with them. Identified a few different areas that felt like had a lot of similarity in their themes, and then did some close reading to try and understand what we can learn about girlhood and its relationship to rape culture through these themes. So my 5 categories of analysis: orgasm and sexual awakening, pleasure as a site of analysis. I didn't say no, but I didn't say yes either, passivity and the normalization of trauma. Letters to my teenage self, reflections on girlhood, consciousness, and reclamation. Girlhood and the politics of speaking, and what does reclamation look like? Okay, I have some examples from each of these categories. We'll see how we're doing on time as we work our way through. I also want to give another content warning as we're about to do some close reading together. So for this first category, I didn't say no, but I didn't say yes either, passivity and the normalization of trauma. I think I'm going to begin by reading the narrative, and then we'll talk a little bit about what this analysis says. All right. When I laid down, my head was on the pillow. Now it's rammed up against the headboard. Surely he'll notice, but no. And I don't want to make a fuss, disrupt his rhythm. I'm starting to feel like an instrument for his masturbation. Not seen, not here, my comfort not considered, no needs to meet. Best to just let him finish. Women do it all the time. Many do a lot worse. Some get raped. This isn't rape. Surely I never said no, didn't try to stop him. I close my eyes, a tear leaks out and trickles into my ear. So stories in this category and this narrative also speaks to that. Look in between the space of the yes and the no that we often view, that we often understand consent through. So it complicates that and explores kind of the moments that both create trauma and subvert trauma without that explicit consent or lack thereof. These narratives tell of the complexities that influence the ability to consent and the nuances of articulating desire, desiring, and it largely explores how passivity and silence reflect gender norms of female docility and also sexual obligation. And this narrative articulates that really well. You can see the individual struggling between obligation, what should I do versus what do I desire, what do I want to do. So this section was one of the first that I formed because it was really important for kind of rejecting this idea of consent as something that you either explicitly say or refute or don't give, and making it clear that trauma exists in lots of complicated ways and can be perpetuated without the presence of a yes or a no. The second section is called Letters to My Teenage Self, Reflections on Girlhood, Consciousness, and Reclamation. So in the middle of the summer, we released a prompt on our social media and asked people, how would you talk to your teenage self about sex? And it was a really popular prompt. We got a lot of specific submissions responding to it. So I'm going to read this submission. Yeah, I think I actually have two. Yeah, we'll start with this one. When I was 15 years old, I took my first pregnancy test. I remember leaving sixth period with a stomach ache, meeting my friend's boyfriend in the hallway outside my classroom. I remember him asking me with a sneering look on his face if I had studied for this test, as he handed me a small cardboard box that made my heart drop to my toes. Asshole. Dear 15-year-old me, this wasn't wrong because you were too young to have sex. This was wrong because you didn't want to have sex. Other people, including yourself, will try to pass off what happened to you as age-inappropriate sex, when it was in fact wrong because it was non-consensual. All right, that was our first submission. I think I'm also going to read this one. Excerpt from Letter to My Teenage Self About Sex. I need to tell you that we replicate trauma, try to reclaim experiences of being taken and feeling invisible in an effort to be in control, to have a hand in this replication, to choose to feel small and not be forced into smallness. Please, I must tell you that there are other ways to reclaim sex, that trauma is not the only language that your body can speak, that you will know more and can know more than a silent no, that your queerness will come to you, be let free from you, and suddenly you will learn how to sing. What I love about these two narratives and also this prompt was that it naturally offers this kind of reflection, this reconciliation with your younger self. And because of hindsight, allows some space to kind of have a conversation with your younger self. Often it felt like there was some forgiveness that happened, some comforting to a younger self who was experiencing trauma or navigating these systems of sex. And it also speaks really well to the way that hindsight as a potential benefit of narrative telling offers a lot of really important insight and also shows really clearly the ways that trauma and the system of rape culture can be resisted. For example, this narrative speaks to queerness. In the narrative before this, spoke to a liberation from the idea of being in a relationship where it was unclear if they were having consensual or non-consensual sex, and being able to really clearly say this was non-consensual, this was wrong, and the articulation of that reclamation of that freedom from the ways that of teenage internalization of sexual obligation is really clear in this area of analysis. Okay, I'm gonna do one more, maybe two more. Let's see. I'm gonna do one more. So we'll skip ahead. I'm going to end with rape culture instills fear. What does reclamation look like? I'm going to end with this analysis because I think it's really fundamental to this project. We spent so much time over the summer reading these really terrible stories of sexual violence, sexual harassment, non-consensual sex. And around that time, we also received a submission, someone saying that they had previously been really, really scared of men. And after reading these stories, that was reinforced. And we realized that there was a high potential that by housing all of these stories, we were perpetuating the fear that rape culture instills, and it's rape culture's ability to steal pleasure just because of the force of its potential. And so just as it's equally important to expose the violence of rape culture, it's also as important to highlight, to sing about, to celebrate the ways that it's subverted and the ways that it's resisted. So this section of analysis reads the ways in which people have recovered from rape culture and also found sexual joy and liberation. I'll read this submission. Being intimate with a woman, I found that mutual pleasure was finally central, and there was no end goal to constitute actions as sex or not sex. Anything was that sex if I felt like it was, or it wasn't sex because I cared less about it, if it was or wasn't. The first time a girl went down on me, I felt like I could say I had sex for the first time. And so some kind of common ways that we saw this reclamation, this liberation from rape culture was queerness, as articulated here. In the former category, we talk about pleasure. And so we saw that as well, people's experiences with first orgasms, where they realized what kind of pleasure was being repressed and then what kind of pleasure was possible. A lot of just really, really, truly beautiful acts of resistance. And words that articulate what that looks like and the potential of healthy and happy and consensual sex that were possible outside of the violence of rape culture. Oops. I'm going to finish by talking about the house in practice and kind of the significance of this collective biography practice and its potential for encouraging voice. This was a submission we found tacked to the outside of the house after our first installation. It reads, I'm upset, feel like crying, am crying. It was wrong. I didn't deserve it. I'm grateful for this. Thank you for speaking. I'm finally letting my heart weep and my chest flow out, and it will be okay, but it is hard right now. And this submission, articulates kind of exactly what the house is trying to emulate, that when we have stories that are repressed, specifically these stories that exist in that gray space that aren't just about sexual violence, but just about navigating and existing and being socialized in a culture where sexual violence is so normalized. When we have the stories that speak to that experience in people and they're brought into public spaces and you can't ignore them and you're engaging with them, it gives permission, it gives space for others to also have that reflection and to share that voice. And this submission was a clear testimony to that. This is a picture of one of the chalkboards that we have on the house. It says, what is essential to a positive sexual experience? You can see lots of fun things, and this is getting at, that goal to also celebrate sexual reclamation. So lube, consent, laughter, pillows, pegging, shamelessness. I'll just finish by asking, how would you talk to your younger self about sex? Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, so much for leading the way and offering that initial presentation in this triad. That was beautifully done, and I'm looking forward to the discussion after the collection of presentations. So our next presenter is Ryce Matsumoto. Welcome, Ryce, and we are all ears and eyes.
All right, thank you so much. Let me get this up. All right, so thank you. So my thesis project, I'm Ryce Matsumoto. I am a senior at the University of Puget Sound, and this project was for the same thesis class that Emma was in. So Emma has seen this before. My thesis is titled Capturing the Relationship Between Human Hegemonic Expectations of Gender and Nature Photography, Frame by Frame. And I want to begin with this quote by a photographer named Scott Lorenzo. The picture that you took with your camera is the imagination you want to create with reality. And I think this, while it encompasses photography as a whole, you'll understand why I chose this quote as we reach the latter parts of this paper. So when I first started this project, I asked myself, what is this relationship between human hegemonic expectations of gender and nature as captured via photography? And I want to note that my project is done within the constraints of Western society and its values. So as I journeyed through this project, I did ultimately conclude that expectations of gender are imposed upon the natural world via photography, but maybe not exactly as how you might expect. And for my methodology for this project, I say theory, but really it's one theory, and that's Judith Butler. But a lot of my evidence is actually based on the writings of Patrick Keating, and he's a communications and cinematic professor who wrote a paper on the lighting techniques as used by cinematic and human portraiture throughout history, and really noted that there is a gendered way in which lighting is used. And then using those two, I took a look at sets of photos selected from Edward Weston, Richard Avedon, and Steve Mccurry, and kind of made comparative analyses. Unfortunately, I am not able to show those pictures today because there is an issue of copyright, but I have done my best to explain them in text and will also verbally explain them. And as a note, all of my analysis and observations are made purely on the notes of lighting techniques, simply because this is a topic that has not been thoroughly discussed or explored. And so I wanted to make sure that I didn't delve too far down the rabbit hole. So the first thing, Patrick Keating. The first thing that's really important about what Keating notes is that there is a writing by a famous photographer, Paul L. Anderson, on character. And he states, men are most likely to have strongly marked characters since their mode of life tends to develop the mental processes and to encourage decision, whereas our present unfortunate ideals of feminine beauty include toward mere regularity of outline and delicacy of complexion. And that plays out in the three lighting techniques that I'll explain right now. So the first lighting technique is contrast. This is something you're probably a little familiar with. It's most commonly used in shadows or light versus dark. But contrast in itself is really just the overemphasis or lack of emphasis of any shadows or color. And then the next is lens diffusion, also known as blur. And this is anything that softens the physical features of a photo. So it could just be the way that a texture is shown or the actual visual effect of blur. And then the last thing is backlighting. And backlighting, while a technique, actually impacts the contrast and lens diffusion. And that's really the only way you can see it. But the idea of backlighting is that it looks at the type of light source. So whether it's natural, unnatural, artificial, or warm and dark. And then the number of them. So is there one light source or are there many, and where are they placed? And what Keating noticed is that photos of women tend to have less contrast, they have warmer tones and colors, and there is more blur. Whereas photos of men have more contrast, there are darker tones and colors, and there is very minimal blur. And then, of course, as Emma did a good amount of discussion on Butler, but my focus with Butler is the idea of gender performativity. And simply because gender is not just performative in its execution, but it's performative in nature. And I think what's important, as you'll find, is that gender performance is done by who is creating the act. So typically when we think of gender performance, we think, for instance, oh, I'm going to perform my non-binary gender identity. But what I'm arguing here today is that photographers, because they're the ones creating an image, create a gender performativity of their subject. So the first photos I had were from Edward Weston. He does not have multiple subjects in his photos. So these are the only photos that do not have both nature and humans in them. And the first image is nude, 1936, and it depicts a nude woman curled up in a doorway with her face hidden. The woman's skin, the skin color, door, and floor are all of the same color, whereas the actual doorway is black. And then the second image I chose is Shell, 1927. And this depicts an upright shell of a very light color in front of a completely dark background, and the reflection of the camera's flash is visible on the shell. Also important to note is that all of Edward Weston's photos were in black and white, so there is no analysis of is there any other color? And so the lighting techniques that you see here is that nude has a singular light source. It's very natural. It creates this warm tone, whereas shell, it's very clearly artificial. As mentioned, you can see the flash reflected on the shell. And so there's that difference where the artificial and the very intense is used for a so-called masculine sharp image, whereas this warmer hue is shown on an image of a woman. And then you see these dichotomies with contrast and lens diffusion as well. In nude, we have the high contrast of color between the doorway and pretty much the rest of the image. And beyond the doorway, there is no other shadow. Whereas with shell, you have a starkingly white shell surrounded by black, and where all the shadows of the shell are overly emphasized. And with lens diffusion, the nude is made to create a very soft, delicate look, both in the way it was captured, but also the fact that the woman's skin is captured in such a way that it looks like it could be blurred. If you were to zoom in on the photo, it is clearly in focus, but the doorway seems sharper than the woman. And with shell, as mentioned, there is no blur. Everything is in immaculate focus, even the forefront of the shell and the back. The second photographer I used, as mentioned, was Richard Avedon. He was a fashion photographer. And the first image was Dovima with elephants, evening dress by Dior, Cirque d'Hiver in Paris. And this depicts a woman in a black and white dress, this dress of which disperses the human figure. So it's a little harder to identify her. And she's standing in front of several elephants. The elephants and the background of this image are all of the same color, so they all the same shade of sepia brown. And then the second image is Ronald Fisher, Beekeeper, Davis, California. And both of these images are very renowned for Richard Avedon, so you can find them on the internet quite immediately. But this depicts a pale man with a swarm of bees on him. He's wearing no clothes, and he's standing in front of a completely white background. And the only colors that you can really see in this image are created by the bees and the man's bodily features. So zero shadows whatsoever. And as for the lighting techniques, we see that Dovima, it appears to be taken outside in natural light. So again, with the warmer color. Whereas Ronald Fisher, Beekeeper, it's clearly taken in a studio, and light appears to be coming from all angles. Otherwise, you would not have as minimal shadows as they were. Tying into that, we have high contrast with Beekeeper, whereas contrast with Dovima is very muted. Yes, there's the browns and the natural shadows created by a singular light source, but nothing pops out per se. And then lens diffusion. We have, with Dovima, the entire image is in focus. And yes, if you were to zoom in, you could identify the individual quirks of the elephant's skin, etc. But the singular light source and the choice of sepia creates a very almost muddied image, in the sense that you see it, but the details kind of just fade away. Whereas with Ronald Fisher, the effect of the bees, the man, and a completely white background creates this image that is extremely focused, much like Shell was. And you could look at the details of the bee, you can look at the details of the man. Even the foreground looks completely in detail. And the last photographer I had used was Steve Mccurry, and he's a photojournalist. So much of his photos, you'll find I can't actually analyze the backlighting as well, simply because that is a feature that photojournalists can't modify. But the first image I chose was titled India, and it depicts a young girl in a dark pink dress leaning on a pillar, and there is a cow right behind her. You can only see the cow's head. And the cow, pillar, and the background are all of the same color. So they're a kind of brownish cement color. And then the second photo, Crownlit Tongue, Tibet, is of a young boy in dark clothes, and he's wearing this yellow hat, and all of his clothing is big. He's holding a tiny brown and white puppy in his hands, and he's standing in front of a wall with beautiful artwork, mixture of blues, greens, yellows, whites, and the wall itself beyond that is your cement to gray. The backlighting here with India, it's the way that Avedon composed this. Obviously, I can't comment too much on it, but it's a natural light source and it is coming from the front, same as Kamletong. But it plays an impact, well, the way I think he was able to use it a little creatively, because with contrast, there are very few shadows in India. So there are obviously the contrast of the pink dress versus the girl's brown face, which is very similar to the cow pillar in the background, but that is the only contrast you'll see. Whereas Kamletong, not only is there a contrast between these dark clothes and this very light colored puppy, but there's an extreme amount of shadows, not just the boy's clothes, but the wall creates these shadows. And the only blur you actually see in Kamletong is the edge of the photos, which really just means that the photographer used a wide angle lens, whereas India, the entire foreground is blurred. And that's kind of ties into lens diffusion. You see this gendered use where every image with a female subject has some sort of blur to it, whereas every image with a male subject is very sharp. And essentially what we're finding is that these human hegemonic expectations of gender are imposed on the natural world, but they're done so by the photographers and the lighting techniques that they've been taught. And kind of in reference to what I was saying about Judith Butler, but photographers dictate and create the image that we see on a screen. And so in doing so, they are, in a sense, creating a performance of gender. And if there's, obviously, I have been speaking a little fast and I apologize about that. But what these three photographers and their sets of photos have shown us is that there is never a blend between the three techniques. So you never see an image of a woman with maybe sharp contrast, high blur, or low contrast, but everything's in detail. It's always this dichotomy of all three techniques are the ones that are used in such a way that Keating would describe as used for feminine portraiture, and then the other dichotomy of all the techniques used in a way that is traditionally and has been used for masculine photos. So what does this mean? Well, there's obviously this role, the role of photographers in creating these gendered expectations, because what they take a photo of, we reflect back. And this is actually something that Judith Butler kind of references in one of her works, but we perpetuate a cycle in which humans impose our expectations, the image gets reflected at us, and based on that image, we internalize and re-perpetuate expectations. But really what we're seeing here, at least with nature, is that it's all artificial. If we ask the photographers to purposely think about how they're creating these photos, if there's even a relationship between natural images and how they're trying to portray them with gender or with humans, then we can stop, we can put a halt to this. So because this is a new topic, there is a lot of research we still have to do. So I want to use more photographers, more photos, and hopefully more theory, but that can be done at a later time. And thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Ryce. Yes, both Emma and Ryce, beautiful work. So we have one more presentation and then we will have time for further discussion. So our third presenter is Phoenix Bruner, and thank you for concluding the panel, Phoenix, and nice to see you and hear your project again.
Yeah, thank you, Rishona. For those that don't know, Rishona was my thesis advisor, so she's had the chance to hear this before, but I'm glad to be able to do it again. So I'll go ahead and get this set up. Okay, cool. So I'm Phoenix. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior English major with a minor in gender studies, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Gender Studies Symposium this year. And this is my thesis. So I titled it The Persistence and Impossibility of Queer Life, Representations of Queerness in Katherine Mansfield's At the Bay. So last semester, I wrote this thesis, and it was for Rishona's seminar titled Modernist Short Stories. And going into it, I honestly was thinking that I was going to struggle. I didn't really understand modernism. It wasn't my favorite genre. And it was because modernists tend to describe things that seem inconsequential. So they'll spend pages and pages talking about what a house looks like, but then use one sentence to tell you that the main character of the story has died. Yeah, I'm talking about Virginia Woolf, if anybody knows To the Lighthouse. But over the course of the semester, I started to fall more and more in love with the stories that we were reading. And I began to realize that the point of modernism wasn't to entertain in the ways that I was used to. Many modernist writers actually use their stories as a place to examine the human mind and comment on larger social issues. I was and definitely still am particularly smitten with a writer by the name of Katherine Mansfield. While large-scale events of the time, like World War I, the flu epidemic, industrialization, etc., certainly impacted some of Mansfield's work, many of her stories serve as a commentary on issues that existed outside of these events. She spent a great deal of time writing about childhood and growing up, marriage and desire, and gender roles. Part of Mansfield's career was spent as a reviewer for a modernist magazine called the Athenaeum, and the majority of the fiction pieces she encountered while working there disappointed her. Mansfield was fascinated by, or perhaps even obsessed with, pursuing a new form of expression following the war. This also made her criticize and want to change her own work to represent the new and, in her mind, superior direction of fiction. However, Mansfield struggled to find publications that would print her work, causing her to become frustrated that inferior and formulaic content was being published instead. Her stories prioritized impressionistic prose, epiphanic structures, and movement inwards to focus on the inner workings of her characters' minds. Many critics argue that Mansfield's involvement in the Athenaeum originated from a desire to further her husband's career or from her anger at his rumored affair. Others, however, argue that readings of Mansfield's work as products of jealousy undermine her professional association with the Athenaeum. They say that these readings give insufficient consideration to the material that she published in the paper, including publishing over 115 literary reviews of novels and short stories. So if her work wasn't entirely motivated by her husband, what was actually driving her? Some argue that these reviews functioned as a space for Mansfield to interrogate the place of fiction in the contemporary world and its need to break free of conventional and conservative norms. She was fascinated by the progression and recreation of fiction. Mansfield used the short story as a space in which to confront anxieties about taboos, especially regarding queerness. I had originally intended to compare multiple of Mansfield's stories, but when I started looking at one story in particular titled At the Bay, I realized that my hands were a lot fuller than I thought. At the Bay is a 12-part tale in the life of the bourgeois family, the Burnells. The story focuses on the Burnell children and their playtime, discussions and thoughts about marriage, and dichotomies between the masculine and the feminine. It's filled with pastoral descriptions of Crescent Bay, a land of sea mist, bungalows, and roaming sheep. The residents, however, are less picturesque. In the second section, we meet the comical duo of Stanley Burnell and his brother-in-law, Jonathan Trout. Stanley is framed as a hypermasculine character through his dedication to competition, irritability, and territorial nature. Pairing him with Jonathan, a man who, according to Stanley, cannot stop talking about his dreams, presents us with a dichotomy centered around the definitions of masculinity. They are really the only two adult male characters we encounter in the story, except for a man by the name of Mr. Harry Kember, but we will get to him a little bit later. On the feminine side of things, there are almost too many women to keep track of. This large cast of female characters allows for more definitions of femininity. My analysis centers around two women in particular. The first, Beryl, the highly impressionable young woman stuck in her fantasies, dreaming about her prince or princess charming. The second is Mrs. Harry Kember, who I will sometimes refer to as Mrs. HK, just for ease of reading, is a slightly older woman who is defined by her smoking habit and her inability to conform. In the fifth section of the story, we are privy to the awkward yet homoerotic interaction between Beryl and Mrs. Harry Kember on a beach. Mrs. HK is detested by other women at the Bay, and we learn from Beryl's internal thoughts that her mother disapproved of Mrs. Harry Kember, and that the women at the Bay thought that she actively sought excitement or pleasure and that she was sexually promiscuous. This interpretation of Mrs. HK is spot on. She doesn't hesitate to encourage Beryl to undress in front of her, and she says, "Don't mind me, why be shy? I shan't eat you. I shan't be shocked like those other ninnies." By stating that she won't be shocked by Beryl's nakedness and referring to the other women as ninnies, Mrs. Harry Kember separates herself from the culture of female modesty present elsewhere on the beach. It's no surprise that the other women at the Bay criticize Mrs. HK. She's an outsider in the community. Even Beryl describes her as disgraceful and cold. She has no vanity, uses slang, treats men as though she were one of them, and doesn't care about her house or her servant. She is the only woman at the Bay who smokes and smokes incessantly, quote, keeping the cigarette between her teeth while she talked and only taking it out when the ash was so long you could not understand why it did not fall. Her smoking habit serves to further separate Mrs. HK from the other women, especially considering that it is one of her most defining qualities. She seems almost physically attached to her cigarette, considering that she doesn't take it out of her mouth even when speaking and only does so when the ash becomes absurdly long. When envisioning her corpse, the women at the Bay see her stretched as she lay on the beach, but cold, bloody, and still with a cigarette in the corner of her mouth. It is never explicitly stated that the other women view her smoking as grotesque, yet the fact that she is the only one who partakes in it implies that there is something off-putting about the act. Mrs. HK's attachment to smoking manifests itself in her appearance as well. Her face is described as long and narrow and exhausted looking, and her fair curled fringe looks burnt out and withered, all attributes of a smoked cigarette. We can see that Beryl is simultaneously disgusted and seduced by Mrs. Harry Kember. She passes judgment on the way Mrs. HK behaves, but also appreciates the beauty and confidence that she feels as a result of their interactions. Beryl recognizes this conflict when she says that she, quote, felt that she was being poisoned by this cold woman, but longed to hear what Mrs. HK had to say. However, while the women are swimming, Mrs. Harry Kember's face begins to look like a horrible caricature of her husband. Beryl's fascination with Mrs. HK suddenly turns into a feeling of repulsion when she morphs into her husband and blurs the lines between the binary genders. This blurring of gender lines in Mrs. HK signals a departure from traditional femininity. In the 12th and final section of At the Bay, readers get to travel into Beryl's fantasy world. It opens with her thoughts about different and queer feelings that one gets in their own room at night. She then envisions two people, a man and a woman, standing in the middle of the room embracing. She rushes to the window with yet another pastoral description of the landscape and finds herself looking at a sad bush. She says, quote, "It is true when you are by yourself and you think about life, it is always sad. All that excitement and so on has a way of suddenly leaving you, and it's as though in the silence somebody called your name and you heard your name for the first time." Beryl recognizes the loneliness of living in solitude and says that she wants a lover to come save her. For a moment, her lover no longer has a determined gender. She only refers to them as lover. But then she returns to questioning whether he will come when, as if on cue, she notices a man walking toward the house. Could this be her long-awaited knight coming to rescue her from the jaws of singlehood? Alas, no. It turns out to be the dashing yet dangerous Mr. Harry Kember. And if that name sounds familiar, that's because he is the husband of the Mrs. Harry Kember that Beryl was with on the beach. When Mr. HK asks her to join him on a walk, she declines, but, quote, something stirred in her, something reared its head and she longed to go. Beryl's conflicted response to Mr. HK mirrors her response to his wife in the beach scene. However, after Beryl decides to join him on the walk, she almost immediately regrets it. Mr. Harry Kember tries to get her to walk with him to a poorly lit spot, and she refuses. He becomes enraged and grabs her. She breaks free and runs home. This section, and therefore the story itself, closes rather abruptly and ambiguously with a description of the darkness created by a cloud covering the moon. Quote, "A cloud, small, serene, floated across the moon, In that moment of darkness, the sea sounded deep, troubled. Then the clouds sailed away, and the sound of the sea was a vague murmur as though it waked out of a dark dream. All was still. The narration moves from an intense and sexually charged confrontation to another picturesque description. The speaker places emphasis on the darkness of the moment. The fact that something as small and serene as a cloud could control the light of the moon and the sounds, or perhaps emotions, of a body as powerful as the sea leaves much room for interpretation. One such reading is of sexual ambiguity. There is a sexual and/or romantic connection between the moon and the sea, represented in the ebb and flow of the tides and the light that shines from the moon. When that light is disrupted, the sea becomes troubled, similar to the way in which Mr. Harry Kember is enraged by Beryl's rejection of him. Beryl is not only denying Mr. Harry Kember, but fighting with heteronormative romance altogether. So what was Mansfield doing with this final section and incredibly ambiguous ending? Well, let's begin with the Kembers. There are certainly similarities between them, such as connections to vice or the way in which they speak down to people. But why is Beryl so frightened by one and not the other? It could have to do with the fact that many of the other women think that Mr. Harry Kember could be a murderer, but I think it's deeper than that. Objectively speaking, what Mrs. Harry Kember encourages Beryl to do, getting undressed in public, can be seen as much more scandalous than what her husband is asking for Beryl to join him on a walk. And yet, while she hesitates at both actions, Beryl willingly undresses and refuses the walk. At the Bay suggests that this is because Beryl's true romantic fantasy lies with Mrs. Harry Kember. We already know that Beryl is disgusted by Mr. HK based on her reaction to Mrs. HK's transformation into him. This transformation took Beryl out of the fantasy she had been living in while spending time with Mrs. Harry Kember. I've established why Beryl and the other women at the Bay find Mrs. HK repulsive, but why is Beryl drawn to her? I think the reasons are exactly the same. Mrs. HK is everything that the others are not. There's an order that the Burnells and the other families follow. For example, early in the story, we learn that, quote, it was understood that at 11 o'clock, the women and children of the summer colony had the sea to themselves. First, the women undressed, pulled on their bathing dresses, and covered their heads in hideous caps like sponge bags. Then the children were unbuttoned. But Mrs. HK openly and adamantly refuses to adhere to social constructs and transcends gender boundaries. She represents disorder and chaos, something that Beryl seems to crave. Beryl wishes that someone would take her all away from these other people to live a life all new, all theirs from the very beginning. In the midst of her sorrow, Beryl's thoughts are disrupted by none other than Mrs. Harry Kember. She hears Mrs. HK telling her, "Oh, go on, don't be a prude, my dear. You enjoy yourself while you're young, that's my advice." While Beryl is terrified of Mr. Harry Kember, who happens to be the only male character that shows interest in her, the fact that she refers to her dream lover as a man overshadows the desire for a feminine romance. In theory, that would take Mrs. Harry Kember off the table. However, Mrs. HK occupies a middle ground between the two binary genders by embracing both masculinity and femininity. This provides the reader with insight into the complexity of a queer identity in a patriarchal and heteronormative context. It is these depictions of queer identities at the Bay that support claims that Mansfield engages with lesbian desire. One scholar argues that Mansfield and Mrs. Harry Kember shared the characteristics of childlessness, unconventional behavior, and the fact that their husbands were closely associated with other women. While I agree with the assessment that Mansfield gave many of her own characteristics to Mrs. Harry Kember, I think she also uses Mrs. HK to explore its societal anxiety about queerness. Through my research, I learned that Mansfield had a fascination with and aversion to Oscar Wilde. Mansfield was worried that Wilde's influence on her writing might appear to merge with sexual influence, which could result in a negative public reaction to her work. While Mansfield may have been anxious about associations with Wilde writing, some argue that his ideas, quote, allowed her a space in which such desires for women might be recognized and framed. The newfound energy and courage she gained from this influence is reminiscent of the way that Beryl feels about being encouraged to undress by Mrs. Harry Kember. But as we've seen, Beryl's encounters with queer desire do not always yield positive results. Mansfield felt a lot of anxiety that her work was still being viewed as sexually deviant. She feared Wilde's influence as much as she was attracted to it. If it's true that Mansfield was simultaneously fascinated by Wilde and unnerved by his influence, then there are obvious parallels to Beryl's views of Mrs. Harry Kember. Mrs. HK's crass and homoerotically charged statements inspire confidence in Beryl to the point where Beryl decides to undress in front of her, while also giving Beryl a sense of unease. She feels as if Mrs. Harry Kember is poisoning her, but longs to hear what she has to say. While researching Mansfield, I came across analysis of her journals that claimed that, in a letter to her publisher, Mansfield faintly echoed one of Wilde's epigrams from Dorian Gray. And it's, "I like persons better than principles, and I like persons with no principles better than anything else in the world." If this is true, then Wilde's opinions about persons with no principles stuck with her. But why stop at the pages of her notebook? Is it possible that Mansfield wrote these people without principles into her stories? Absolutely. And at the Bay, outsiders and characters that have no principles are presented as failures. Thinking of persons with no principles as failures led me to consider the work of Jack Halberstam, a professor of gender studies and English. If his name sounds familiar, it's probably because he was one of the keynote speakers at last year's Gender Studies Symposium. He argues that failure presents an opportunity rather than a dead end. Both Wilde and Halberstam idealize failure, a mindset which may have found its way into parts of At the Bay, specifically in the character of Mrs. Harry Kember. We already know that the rest of the women at the Bay dislike Mrs. HK for her rudeness and nonconformity. That alone makes her a failure. However, when looking at depictions of Mrs. HK's physical appearance and her actions, it's clear she does not care about fitting in. She has embraced her failure as a style, making her an embodiment of Halberstam's proposed queer aesthetic, defined by, quote, a resignation to failure, to lack of progress, and a particular form of darkness. She adjusts to less light rather than seeking out more. Halberstam emphasizes darkness as a large part of what defines queerness and failure. He says that queerness is the dark landscape of confusion, loneliness, alienation, impossibility, and awkwardness, and that darkness is the terrain of the failed and the miserable. Yet Mrs. Harry Kember is not confused, awkward, or miserable. Beryl, on the other hand, is all of these things. She has no one to talk to and wants someone to come take her away from the life she is currently living. While Beryl fights against embracing the style of failure, Mrs. Harry Kember flourishes in the fluidity between masculinity and femininity and encourages Beryl to claim her freedom. So the idea for my project was sparked by my first reading of the beach scene in At the Bay, and anyone who knows me knows that I love characters who aren't afraid to stir the pot. So naturally, I latched on to Mrs. Harry Kember. And after reaching the end of that section the first time, when Mrs. Harry Kember morphs into her husband, I immediately knew that I had to do something with it. It became the base for my entire project. I knew there had to be a reason why Mansfield played with gender in that way, and I was determined to figure out why. While it seems that outsiders in Mansfield's story are cast in a negative light, Halberstam's views of failure made me think about what they bring to the story. It's through failure characters like these, ones that embody Wilde's notion of no principles, that Mansfield could break free from convention and create the new world of fiction. Mansfield presents her readers with the dichotomy of a complete embrace of the queer aesthetic and a resistance to queerness and failure. Through this, Mansfield captures both the persistence of queer life and the staging of queer life as impossible. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoenix. It was lovely to hear that again, or hear it in this version and in this setting, which is it's always so thrilling, really, to be part of an interdisciplinary conversation. So, you know, I'm sort of, in a very good way, agitated by the combination here of three-dimensional and architectural installation in the history of photography and literary fiction, modernism in particular, cohabiting this thinking space. So once again, thanks to everybody for these really wonderful projects and presentations. So I am officially the moderator, but I'm also thrilled to be here with the co-organizers of the symposium, including Phoenix and Kim Brodkin, who is the chair of the symposium and a skilled leader in every way. So, you know, I invite all of you leaders to join me in helping to run this discussion. Kim, I don't know if you've already received some questions in the chat. Okay, so and Kim, are we supposed to officially ask everybody to unmute their videos, but keep their audio muted so that maybe we can feel more that we are in a room together?
We do not, we could unmute all of the videos of the audience if you wish, but they are unable to unmute themselves currently.
Oh, okay.
Or they could just be unmuted as they wish to be called upon. So however you prefer.
Okay. Well, why don't we start, Phoenix, Ryce, and Emma, do you have a preference for whether people are muted or unmuted in a particular way. Kim, do you have a preference? So we just, okay. So I'll wait and see if you want to use your reaction button to raise your hand, Kim will moderate that. I think you'll keep track of the raised hands, or we'll both keep track of the raised hands. And see if and while you're thinking of a question or a comment, just one thing that occurred to me as a potential connection. I'm not sure I can formulate this as a question, but I was really struck in looking at the two portraits of Katherine Mansfield that Phoenix showed by seeing them anew through Ryce's methodology. So the first portrait, which is so dear to me, I'm particularly enamored of that particular portrait of Mansfield with sitting in the lawn chair with the big magazine in her lap. That one struck me as so unfeminine by Ryce's in Ryce's terms, very sharp, really very sharp. And the other portrait, though, does seem to adhere more to the conventions that Ryce was laying out for us. So therefore, Phoenix, I sort of see Mansfield anew as photographed in both ways, which seems to fit with the complexity that you are sort of teasing out of both her writing and her lived experience. I mean, there's more to say about her lived experience, but it does sort of bear out some of the things that you're suggesting. So Ryce, it was really great to have that toolbox, as it were, to think about the portraiture with. And actually, Emma, your house came to mind as a you know, like 100 years later, really, almost to the year, you know, giving us a different house of femininity than the one that Phoenix is pointing to, which she didn't detail as much, but she does say there are sort of too many women in the story, women and girls to keep track of. And there is this sense that the house is a kind of separate space from which they love to exile the men. They just love it. But of course, it's 100 years ago. And this is one of those cases where I think what was repressed then, you know, comes out over the century and sort of finds its way into the voice-giving architecture that you have built. And so that was also kind of a provocative contrast for me to think about. Anyway, so as I said, that was more of a comment. That in fact was a comment, not a question. But let's see. Yes, if people would like to turn on their videos, that would be fine. And I'm wondering if others have comments or questions. I have a question for Ryce. It's maybe a fairly, a question you might anticipate, but I know Weston and Avedon, you were introducing me to Steve Mccurry, but I was struck that you're talking about a very dualistic kind of lighting use, and all of your examples are male photographers. So I wondered if you had looked at, it looked like the last slide went by a little bit quickly for me. So I was wondering if you had thought of counter examples, or whether there's any work that you're doing or that others have done on female photographers, and whether that dichotomy holds up in their work.
Yes, and that's a great question. So when I started searching for photographers, I really wanted to use photographers who were known for their work that captured both humans and nature. And so these were names that came up. And when I was originally writing my thesis, a lot of it was spent actually trying to understand where we stood in understanding this relationship. And so I decided, because it's such a new topic, I didn't want to delve too deep into the rabbit hole because there's so much risk when you do that. My professor was telling me, you know, I don't want to risk anthropomorphization. And that's something I had originally accidentally done. So choosing to restrict myself and limit myself to a smaller group of photographers was a purposeful decision. But yes, my hope would be if any research were done further beyond this, yes, having a wider range, maybe looking at not just photographers of different gender, but photographers who aren't white and are in the West, or photographers who aren't as necessarily known for their photographs that depict both nature and humans. So there's a lot of work to be done, but that's kind of what it's like to take the first step.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And yeah, I hope you'll be continuing to think about this. It seems like you've come to a certain point that's quite productive, and you have a lot of insights and clarity about what you're doing, as well as curiosity. Emma, I also had a question for you, which is maybe also not entirely unpredictable. So I'm stunned by the work that you did and the material that you collected, and it's extremely moving. And I guess my question is, if it's a rather crude question, is can this work be taken off of a college campus?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Our initial vision for this project was actually for it to not exist on the UPS campus as its like singular location, but COVID changed a lot for us. So the idea was we were going to have kind of multiple installations throughout the summer in the like larger Tacoma area, able to go into different neighborhoods and different communities at a variety of kind of local events, the kind of events that used to happen in the summer when we could all gather, to diversify the story that we were telling and collecting in the house. That all changed with COVID, and the university was able to work with us to make sure we could develop something that was safe and distant. We had resources to make sure that could happen. It is still our dream for that to happen in other spaces. We did run out of money from our grant, so that's a thing we are thinking about right now, but the house is in Tacoma and still on wheels and has the potential to move, and I would very much like it to continue to move.
Thank you. I'm glad I asked that, because it did not occur to me that was a kind of COVID contextualized limitation, and I'm sure you can imagine why it wouldn't necessarily occur to me. But that's really interesting. So good luck with your grant applications. Yeah, interesting. Okay,
we have a question in the chat that I'm happy to share. So this is directed to Phoenix. Considering that you did not have time to address more of Mansfield's work, how do you see these themes play out in other short stories of hers? And the follow-up question to that is how you chose At the Bay.
Yeah, so Rishona knows my whole process because we spent quite a bit of time talking about it. But when researching Mansfield, I mean, we read a bunch of her short stories. We kind of had four main authors that we focused on, and she was one of them. And so I have like her whole collection that has At the Bay in it. I bought it from the bookstore because I decided I wanted to keep my thesis research with me. But I mean, there are some of her other stories that I was gonna look at were Bliss and Her First Fall, and really anything that had a central main, like female main character, which for Mansfield is the majority of her stories. And a lot of other scholars have done like the initial research of being like, these are all of Mansfield's stories that are gay. And so I was like, cool, let's keep going with it. But I chose At the Bay because I thought that this like literally like there was just a literal description of a blurring between gender lines in At the Bay that didn't necessarily happen in some of her other stories. And so I started there, and then I got about 9 pages in, and I wasn't even done with that one story. And so I was like, I don't know that I can keep going with another story without making this like a 40-page paper, which I'm not going to do in one semester. So that's how I kind of came to that. But I've fallen in love with Katherine Mansfield and with Mrs. Harry Kember. I love problematic, like older female characters. You know, it's a trope for sure, but I love it.
Thanks, Phoenix.
I wanted to, if I may, since I am here, I don't know if everybody realizes that At the Bay takes place in New Zealand, which is Mansfield's childhood home, and which she left at a certain point forever. And I think if you were going to write the 40-page version of this, Phoenix, it would be super interesting to think about queerness and empire, queerness and colonial culture, queerness and anti-colonial identity as well, and the relationship between Mansfield and the New Zealand environment and history. I mean, I don't know where that would go, but I think it could be really interesting.
Yeah, that's definitely one limitation of the project that I was working on, is that the queerness in the community that I was talking about and that Mansfield was exposed to is when she was in London and in Paris. And so, you know, it's very, very white, very Eurocentric. And so it definitely does not at all encapsulate representations of queerness. So there is that, but I think, I mean, Rishona, you know, she had all of these issues with like colonialism and anti-colonialism and wrote about them through her stories. And so, yeah, it would be a really interesting direction to take it in. If only I were writing that honors thesis.
I guess since we have a few extra minutes, one thing I would ask is, I know these are all completed projects in the sense that you wrote your theses already, and that portion of it is done. And you've talked about how there are ways in which these projects live on for you and aspects that you're still thinking about. Maybe you could elaborate further on. Phoenix, you just touched on this a little bit, and I think you all did to some extent in your remarks, but if you could elaborate on how you'd like to see this go further, where you'd like to expand, how you'd like for these to survive in other forms beyond the thesis projects that you completed.
Yeah, I can go first. So I'm a hobby nature photographer, and I think that's kind of what got me into this topic. Thankfully, the subjects I like to photograph are ones that are significantly more difficult to even use these techniques that I discussed. So it's never been something that I've had to actually focus on. But the reason why I did this project was because as a photographer, I automatically assumed that this relationship was something that existed. And I thought that it was something that was more talked about. So as I was doing my research, one thing I wanted to do was really just make sure that we bring awareness to this topic, because there was a conference, I believe back in 2010, in which this topic was slightly discussed, but it seems that it never moved forward after that. So bringing this to awareness has been my ultimate goal, because I'm truly not sure when in my future I'd be able to continue the research. But just making people aware and hopefully spreading the word, and hopefully at some point that it reaches photographers and they're able to start thinking intentionally about how they take their photos.
Yeah, I think for me, it's interesting because I'm not planning to go to grad school, I'm not planning to get a PhD. And so with an English presentation, it's kind of like, oh, well, maybe it won't go anywhere. But I think what was really interesting about this project is that I brought contemporary queer theory with Jack Halberstam into a conversation about somebody who was writing in the 1920s with theorists who had been writing in the 1980s. And so it was like this kind of chronological composition. And it really has been interesting to think about as a queer person being depicted as a failure, but embracing that kind of status and embracing, you know, the quote, failed culture that you are a part of and what that actually means. And so I think going forward, I would take that more into not only what I'm reading, but in just like in my general interactions with the rest of the world of, you know, who gets to define failure? Where does it come from?
Yeah, I struggle to answer this question just because I feel like I have like 1,000 different things that I'm thinking about, but I think I want to like literally continue the work of the Girl House project in a variety of ways, if that's doing more installations or kind of like transforming the space to be something else. We've talked about, my partner Miranda and I have talked about, you know, doing storytelling, writing workshops and traveling in the house, doing some kind of sex education project with the house, having the house be a permanent installation somewhere, if we could get somewhere to take it. And so that's kind of, those are the questions I'm thinking about right now in terms of kind of like the theoretical work that this project does. I think that, you know, girlhood studies is a really emerging discipline and an exciting discipline, but not a discipline without its limitations. It also tends to be very Eurocentric and has had some pushback from Black feminists for the way that it defines girlhood and raises some questions about like, where is that definition coming from and who gets to experience girlhood and what is girlhood crafted by? And so I'm writing my AFM thesis right now with some kind of similar themes, doing a critical whiteness study of how girlhood is represented. And I'm excited to continue with that thinking and those thoughts and those ideas. And I think this work of integrating voices and autonomous stories, especially with sexual injustice, but also just in general, is so important and so refreshing and so important for crucial for this kind of academic world.
Oh, Adonica, yeah, please unmute and go ahead.
Thank you, Rishona. I wanted to comment to Emma as a mother of a daughter and a mother of a granddaughter. And I have a couple of colleagues, several on this screen, who also are raising daughters. And I love this idea, first of all. It's just a wonderful way to give girl power. And so I'm curious, could you imagine this type of girl house being planted in places where we have young girls to be perceiving their future in a way that empowers them early in their lives?
Yes, great question. And actually some of the most interesting, I didn't get to share it today, but some of the most interesting submissions we had were from mothers who were reflecting on what they would teach their daughters about sex and sexuality that they either hadn't or had been afraid to, or what they would change. And that perspective is so interesting. Yes, I do think that young girls need to interact with this work. I felt like a prompt that I continued to go back to, and that also I felt other people really drawn to, was like, what would your 15-year-old self, like, what would they change if they were reading this and they had this mentorship or this reflection? And you know, I think that there's like a tendency to like think that this is, or yeah, to isolate younger people from reading this kind of content, because it can be explicit, it can be hard to process, and it can be emotional, but it's not like that's not there already. Like, rape culture is all around us, it's in all of the media we consume, and to have people being really vulnerable and autonomous in their processing of that, and I think to internalize that and read that from a young age is really important, not only resisting rape culture, but also encouraging young people to learn about what a healthy sexuality can be.
Thank you. Lovely response.
I think we are actually nearing the end of the 90 minutes. And that was a lovely response, and maybe it is an appropriate place for us to disperse and continue to think about these futures that you've brought us to. So I just want to thank everybody again for their work, and for all of you for coming to this panel. And thank you again, Kim and co-organizers, for the stupendous work that you are doing. So I'll wave goodbye and lovely to be in this space with you. So thanks again.